I'm not sure.
I was wondering that too.
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the City of Green Council meeting. Today's March 12th, 2019. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, will the clerk please call the roll?
Sure. Mrs. Babbitt. Here. Mr. Dyer. Here. Mr. Humphrey.
Here.
Mr. Shaughnessy.
Here.
Mr. Spate.
Here.
Mr. Jurgen.
Here.
Mr. Young.
Here. Okay, the next item on our agenda is the approval of the February 26, 2019 regular meeting minutes.
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for the approval of the February 26, 2019 regular meeting minutes. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Our next item is the approval of the February 2019 financial report subject to audit.
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and a second for the approval of the February 2019 financial report subject to audit. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, the next item, we have a guest this evening. We have Laura, Tubo from First Energy. She's the area manager, and she has a presentation for us. Welcome to our meeting.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the council for giving me a few minutes. I'm the area manager responsible for Green. I took over the role that was previously held by Kirk Gardner. So there was some reorganization in our company, and so I'm happy to serve the city of Green. I live close to here. I live in North Canton. Valerie and I became good friends a couple weeks ago during the windstorm, so that's one of our roles, you know, to provide communications to all of you and to the city administration during those types of events. I put together a packet of information. Nicole has one. There's been some passed out, but she can share it with the council. And it's just some of the tools that you know, are available to you during those wind events, or just generally, you know, to help your constituents in your wards and across the city. On the right side of the packet are some tools that we can use during storms, and this is a one-pager that Nicole can share with all of you. And it talks about the Ohio Edison app, the 24/7 Power Center, which is on our website, and you can see real-time estimated times of restoration just like I can. And so it's kind of nice. Sometimes communities link this to their websites, you know, and then it kind of reduces calls, you know, to the public officials throughout the community. Another thing we included is our vegetation management guidelines, and, you know, tree trimming is always a topic of discussion, you know, in communities between the utility and the community. And this just kind of talks about why we do what we do, what kind of clearance we're looking for, and, you know, why we do this is basically to, you know, ensure reliable electric service. So that's there. And this is a nice little thing about our storm restoration process. We have an intentional process, and there's a priority process that's in place to restore power when things go wrong. And, you know, this kind of outlines what that is. A lot of times you'll hear from somebody, hey, a truck came and I still don't have power. That's intentional. We send around make safe crews first, and then the restoration crews follow after that. We look at critical customers. We look at outages that have the most number of customers associated with them. And then our very last thing is those single no lights, those people that are the last outage associated with their order. So that's a nice little thing that describes that as well. And then on the left side of our packet that I provided to you are ways we can work with you to assist the residents of Green. This is a nice little flyer that talks about some of the customer assistance programs, you know, when people have those storms of life, you know, they can't quite make their utility bill, things like that. This kind of describes, you know, what's available to them, and we can help facilitate that. And then the last thing, First Energy has a foundation, and this is a kind of a flyer about that, and I can help facilitate that as well, but it's available to 501(c)(3) organizations within your city, and we're always happy to support the communities we serve. So just kind of a quick overview of some of the ways we interact, but also provided to all of you is going to be my card, and I'm happy to serve you. So thank you so much for the time.
Very good. We appreciate you being here and your patience, spending your evening here, and your service in our community. Before you take off, does council have any questions or anything?
Yes, Laura, one quick question for you. The tree program that you were referencing regarding trees around power lines, just for clarification, whose responsibility is that? So if a homeowner has a tree that is encroaching a power line, who's responsible for cleaning it
Yeah,
up?
if it's a primary distribution line, we trim for 4 years of clearance. So if you have a specific residence, a specific area, a specific whatever, you can ask me and I can have a forestry specialist look at that. We did provide to the city a general list of where we are going to be trimming. So they do have that information this year.
Excellent, thank you.
Very good.
I just have a couple comments. First of all, Laura, I want to thank you for coming tonight, and thank you. You visited me a few weeks ago, and we talked about these issues. And I kind of look at electricity like a tree, and you know the end users are at the far end of those branches, and so they're typically making things safe, but then they're starting to work from the bigger branches to the smaller branches, so they can get the most people restored at one time. So if that helps people understand the priorities, they're trying to get the most number of people back in service quickly. What was my other point? I had another point. Oh, the other point I wanted to make is that if your neighbor calls for power and they don't have power, and your neighbor calls, you call too, and you have all your neighbors call, because they prioritize based on the number of people who call, even if they know the area. So I want to encourage residents to always call or to use the app to get a hold of First Energy, because it does make a difference. It's not like, well, you know, a fire, if somebody calls, the fire department responds, not everybody has to respond, but it really helps if an electrical issue, if you don't have power, for everybody in your neighborhood to call or to contact First Energy. That's a real thing.
That is a real thing, yeah.
Very good.
We only know about outages via report. And then, of course, once we identify one, we can maybe look at a circuit and see what's going on, but we don't have a screen that shows us that it's out at 123 Main Street. And I learned that as you know, a newer person in the utility, so,
So more data is better.
yes. Thank you for making that point, Mayor.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. We
Thank you.
appreciate it, and thanks for your service to the community.
Yeah, let me know if you need anything.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is the public report. This is an opportunity for anyone to come up and address council, and we have a few people signed in here. First to speak this evening is Mrs. Weaver.
Jane Weaver, 4013 April Drive. I didn't get a chance to make any rebuttal after the conversations among council, so I'd like to discuss the fire station and the trail at this time. I do not feel we need to have more committees to go out in the community and discuss this. I agree with Mr. Yergin. He went out, had forums with people. Mr. Dyer talked to people. The council is practically pleaded up here for people to come in and talk. You had all these people show up tonight, and that shows, and I think it was even mentioned in the paper about it. So that shows that people care about this issue. And then you have the data. I mean, the study was done years ago, 98, nobody seemed to write on the date. But it shows that there was a need for it, and it was just pushed off because of money issues. We have the money. This is the exact thing that the Nexus money is supposed to be used for safety of people, and it hits the whole people. So I really don't see why we need to discuss this money. The facts are there, the people want it, and it's a great use of the money. And Mr. Spate, you talked about money for the parks. I do believe that the parks receive money from our taxes, correct? And you don't really need all that money. One time I talked to you, you have like an excess of money. You wanted to cut down the
Excess of
percentage of
money.
taxes you thought was too high, that we really
No,
didn't
I-
need that much.
Sorry, to clarify, I said that's been a topic of conversation.
conversation.
Where, yeah, people
Okay.
have brought that up in the past.
Okay. Well, you do receive money from our taxes for ball fields. And we have made ball fields available for the ones that were taken away from the pipeline. And I feel that the fire station is way more important than any ball fields. It serves the whole city, not just the few that use the ball fields. And so I think this is a much better use for the fund, and you still have 1.4 million approximately left in the fund that could possibly go to the ball fields. Now I'd like to address the trail plan. and I'd like to emphasize, and you have tried to do this to people, but the plan that was presented was a conceptual plan. I mean, if I put in my GPS, what is the shortest way to get to, say, this winery? And this has happened to me. And it'll take us through these one-lane dirt roads because it'll get me there 1 minute faster. And I believe that's what this plan did. It kind of looked, how can we get things around the fastest? And that's not the way it's going to end up. I'm sure that as you look at the plan, you'll go, most of this should go along the roadways so that we don't intrude on people's yards. And I think a lot is stuck on this, and it needs to be presented. And Mr. Reethy, I don't know if is the committee or the people that did that, are they going to come back with like a more sane route, more what would really work?
No, that'll be modified by the planning department,
Okay. So
and we
then-
will present it
and
at that
then
time.
we could see that
Correct,
it's not
correct.
this, you're going to go through all our yards and we must be notified because a lot of it's just probably going to be street stuff on the, where there's already a right-of-way. So, yes, I believe in notifications, but I think we should hold off until the council discusses it, we get a plan out there, and you don't want, like you said, you don't want to notify people so far in advance, people get all upset, and it would never happen. So I agree with that.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mrs. Weaver. Appreciate your comments. Next to speak, we have Mr. Braswell.
Mr. President,
Mr. Dyer.
before Mr. Braswell gets up there, I think a very important piece of news just came across the wire that the Browns got Odell Beckham Jr., just so you know.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for,
Just wanted to make sure that everyone.
Two draft choices.
That's right, here we go. Sorry.
okay, back to our council meeting. We'll get to ESPN after the meeting, I'm sure. But Mr. Braswell,
Good evening, Steve
You got it.
Braswell, 1207 Peachwood Way. Three things. First, the good. I would like to thank Mr. Mike Elkins from Parks and Rec. Last Saturday, he ran a volunteer event to do some cleanup at the future dog park at Harris Park. It was nice. We did a lot of cleanup work. I would like to also thank the mayor for showing up and supporting us with a couple of hours of hard physical labor, even though he does not have a dog, which we won't hold against him. Two, I agree with Mrs. Weaver about the Citizens Committee, and that's sort of input. I think it's incumbent upon all of you to not abdicate your responsibilities, to actually formulate policy, vote on policy, take responsibility for it. You know, if you're going to abdicate that to a Citizens Committee, we have a word for that in the Lean Six Sigma world. We would say, you know, if you're not going to do your jobs, you're non-value add, or more colloquially, we would say you're waste. Third, the golf course equipment. No matter how you frame it, this is really a matter of a failure of doing due diligence. I think you should push back against first reading passage. I think you should consider alternatives. 15 minutes on Google established that Northeast Ohio is a hotbed of used equipment, late model equipment, low engine hour equipment at 40, 50% off the prices that were already mentioned. So I think that, you know, there are alternatives here. And plus, if you lock into a 5-year deal, what does that do if you exercise the 3-year opt-out option? That means you're going to take an expense hit when you do the capitalization would have to roll off if you were no longer running the golf course. Anything else I want to say about that? Again, I think that if I came up in my job and I missed a $300,000 expense, I probably wouldn't have to worry about it for too much longer. I would be looking for a new job. Thank you.
Mr. Braswell, real quick, may I ask, how many committees do you serve on in the city of Greene?
I volunteer on one committee.
One committee, but I know you've also volunteered with the dog park committee, we're not committee, but the
Yeah.
dog park brainstorming. So is that a delegation of our duties to reach out to the community to figure out if we should or what we should do with the dog park? Or as the chair of the Environment and Parks Committee, should I just say this is what we should do? Or as chair of the Telecommunications Committee, should they dictate what we should do? Or do we use the resources that we have within our committee to get the best type of input available to us? So I don't want to be wasteful up here or whatever.
But at the end
a
of the day,
waste.
committees don't set policy.
They don't, but they
They-
make
they advise?
recommendations for the policymakers. And that's what I
Sure.
think I'm reaching for here.
But
That's it.
As
That's just a
the Parks and
recommendation
Recs
for a
Board,
policy.
I mean,
All right,
That's it.
anything else?
Sorry. Thanks, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Braswell.
Appreciate it.
All right, the next item on our agenda here is the reading of correspondence.
We've got an email from Chris Dyer regarding the trail plan. Email from Green Meadow homeowners regarding the master trail plan. An email from Mia Roweeder regarding the use of Nexus money for a community pool. And that is it.
Thank you, Nicole. The next item is the reading of new legislation. Right back to you.
2019 R15, a resolution authorizing the purchase of a Ventrac tractor from Baker Vehicle Systems, Inc. with ball field groomer and ball field renovator attachments for use by the city service department, declaring certain service department equipment surplus property to be traded in to offset a portion of the purchase price of the ball field groomer, and declaring an emergency.
That'll be referred to the Finance Committee.
2019 R16, a resolution authorizing the City of Greene to enter into a lease agreement for the purchase of miscellaneous equipment for use at the Raintree Golf and Event Center, and declaring an emergency.
That will also be referred to the Finance Committee.
Mr. President,
Mr. Humphrey.
the administration has requested first reading passage on 2019 R16. We did have an opportunity to discuss it this evening. The committee agreed that we should consider this on first reading because of the timeliness of acquiring the equipment. It's going to take a little bit of time to acquire it. The administration walked us through exactly why this equipment was being requested, and I understand Mr. Braswell's point that he's making in terms of perhaps being able to find equipment that is less expensive, that's used equipment, and I guess I would say a couple of points. Number one, even though I wasn't for us acquiring this property, I think now that we have acquired this property and we have someone who is running it for us, I think that we have to trust the recommendation that they're making, especially since this is their specific line of business, as to whether or not having new equipment makes sense. Number two, I think it does make sense in the sense that, let's say that the City of Greene decides to do something else with this property in 2 years. We have a 5-year lease. The operator of the golf course who maintains and operates, 50, 60 other courses throughout the United States would be able to use that equipment. They're the ones that sign the lease, and they would be on the hook for it. We knew going in, this wasn't a surprise. I don't think it was really a failure to plan. We knew going in that we had old equipment that was going to have to be repaired or replaced. And certainly, I would rather have new equipment that is not breaking down every day than have equipment that you can trust and decrease your maintenance costs because you're going to have individuals who are able to operate the equipment versus individuals that have to repair the equipment that ultimately is going to need replaced anyway. And so I think this legislation does make sense. Since the committee has agreed to first reading passage at this time, I would move to bypass committee deliberations on 2019 R16.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to bypass committee deliberations on 2019 R16. Is there any discussion?
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. Spate.
To Mr. Humphrey's point, I understand why this legislation is out there. I guess, we had an understanding that we would have to buy some equipment. But although Mr. Braswell and I aren't seeing eye to eye tonight, I am going to agree with him on not going through or supporting the bypassing the committee deliberations or the 3-reading rule, because I do feel that we should take a little more time on this. We're appropriating a similar amount of money tonight for a stream restoration project that has been in the works for quite some time. We have had the opportunity to research it. I've been out to the park to look at the streams. I have no clue what this contract is or the appropriation for this equipment. And I feel just getting this thrown on tonight, that's a significant amount of money to move on first reading. I really do. I think by pushing it back 2 weeks to give us a little time for some research isn't a bad thing. I still think that there's time in the season for them to go out and make the purchases. But this is like a rental car for this golf, for the Billy Casper Golf. I mean, basically, it's like rental car syndrome, you know? You go out on the road, you get a rental car, you don't own it. And I don't know, you know, you can get the best rental car available to you. So I don't know that this is necessarily the best investment for us at this time. I may feel differently in 2 weeks, so I hope that by our next meeting, I'll have a change of mind. So for this reasons, I won't be supporting the committee deliberations, 3rd reading, or this legislation.
And, Mr. President, I would just like to add, I agree with what Justin has said here. I do have a question, though. It was my understanding that at the end of the lease payments, the city would own the equipment, although I'm hearing that the operator, Billy Casper, would be on the hook if we don't continue using them after 3 years. Is that, can I ask Steve, I guess, is that correct? How does that work? They're on the hook, but we get the prize at the end of the day?
Well, the city will be entering into a lease agreement, and Billy Casper will be making the lease payments on the city's behalf. So the city will not be charged any of the cost of the lease agreement throughout the lease.
So if the city does not continue with Billy Casper at the end of 3 years, the city will still have the lease, right? They will still have to pay for it?
We can stipulate that in the agreement with them, that they would take charge of the equipment after that 3 years and be responsible for taking it on themselves and reimbursing the city.
Are you saying Billy Casper would then keep the equipment?
If in fact they maintain, if in fact they're paying for the equipment, correct.
If they agree to take the lease. But that's not part of this contract, right? Not part of this agreement?
This agreement is allowing them to go ahead and move forward with the purchase of the equipment.
Okay.
That's what this piece of legislation is requesting.
Okay, any other discussion? Should we have a, go ahead, Mr.
Mr. President, yeah, I'm getting kind of queasy about this. I mean, again,
I appreciate it.
I think we need to figure out this 3 and 5 year thing. I don't know. I mean, it's $300,000. It's equipment that, you know, that the golf course may need. But just saying that, you know, we can stipulate that in the agreement, but it's not in the agreement we're voting on. I don't know. I mean, I'm just getting queasy about it. That's all I can say.
I think the other thing is if we knew this was on first reading, we could ask some of these questions, maybe taking a run out to the golf course to see the equipment that would be replaced or whatever we may do. Have a chance to do our due diligence is my point. But tonight to sit here and make a decision for $300,000 is what I'm not comfortable with.
Well, I can appreciate you being queasy and not comfortable with it, but I kind of wish we would have had this discussion during committee. I'll just say that. Mr. Humphrey.
Mr. President, I think, you know, first of all, we did discuss this evening. Second of all, I think that unless any of us were golf course superintendents and mechanics going out and taking a look at equipment and deciding useful life, you know, I don't think it's responsible for this council to have hired Billy Casper Golf and then to question over $300,000 worth of equipment, whether the old equipment that they're using is better than leasing new equipment. I mean, welcome to an election year in the city of Greene, I guess, because this doesn't make sense. This is so pro forma, I can't even imagine that it is in any way controversial. This council determined that Billy Casper Golf was going to operate this golf course. Is it really so outrageous that they have requested equipment so that the operation of the golf course can be run? And keep in mind, they don't make any money unless it's profitable. So they don't want any of this money expended. Believe me, if I'm Billy Casper Golf and I don't have to put forward any of this that's going to chew into the net profits, I would never want to expend this money because that's going to take away from my ability as a corporation to be able to make money. That's why we have an agreement that has the incentives all in the right place. If we don't make money, they don't make money. So it would be against their business interest to tell us to lease equipment that they don't really need because it's going to eat into their profit center. It makes no sense.
It does not eat into their profit, though, correct?
It
comes, no, it comes out of our.
It comes
profits,
out of the net, it comes out of the net profit. It is an operating expense for the course.
In either way, pro forma to spend $300,000 at the request of a contractor for the city is not, that's really not pro forma, I guess. I would think if this were something that were not at the request of the contractor, I would be a little different with it. That's it.
Well-
Just saying, take a little time, doesn't hurt.
Well, they said they need the equipment, but I guess it's going to give you time, Mr. Spate, to go out and look at the equipment and determine if they need it. I don't know how you're going to do
Let's go
that,
hit
but,
9 holes while we're at it. I don't see a problem with it.
okay.
Okay, so we
If-
have a
if-
a motion and a
Mr.
second.
President?
Yeah, Mr. Yergin,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
To me, the question, though, is why is first reading passage necessary? And I suppose, Ms. Carr, if you could speak to that a second.
Well, I think Mr. Schmidt already mentioned, but I'll repeat again that obviously golf season is upon us. Believe me, they started reviewing this stuff as soon as they took over the contract with us. So it's not like they dragged their feet. Then we looked at pricing and all of those things. So that's why we're trying to move it along. I mean, so that we can get the equipment in, because, you know, the weather's going to break. They'll get by, I'm sure, with what we have, but I guess just as to your point, Mr. Spate, in terms of, I'll be happy to tour you. I actually have photos of everything and an inventory that we certainly can share. But I'm just going to give you the ages of some of the equipment. We have a 1969 Massey Ferguson tractor. We have a 1975 tractor mower. We have a 1996 chipper. We have a 1997 John Deere T-mower. The newest piece of equipment is a Toro Buffalo blower, which I don't even know what that is. But this is the type of equipment that we have on hand. And so I guess, again, I want to repeat, we knew going into this, and we even talked about this before the purchase, that there was definitely going to be needed equipment. So
Why couldn't we have had notification about this last week? That's my point is. I
Mr.
guess
Schmidt
to give
sent
us-
out an email.
I've never received any
I
email.
I think that's probably where there's
That's-
a problem.
I think that really is the problem. Had we
So
had
I have an answer to that. Not a great one, but it wasn't brought to my attention, the first reading request tonight. I did speak with Mr. Humphrey, and he said he received an email of it, and it's not on our agenda, and Nicole didn't get it, and neither did I. But I know that it was sent out because there's a copy of the memo, but all of council wasn't copied on it. So that's, I think there was a mistake there in just communication and oversight.
An email was sent out to the president of the finance committee.
Yeah.
Notifying him of the first reading passage, which is what I've done in the past, so.
Yeah. If that's normally what you do, I guess I just thought that maybe,
And also, when
Clerk would get it.
when the legislation was requested to go on first reading passage, it was sent with an email to be included as part, within Granicus as first reading passage, but evidently that did not make it on it, so.
I think that's where we missed it.
And I think, Mr. Humphrey, the difference is this comes at the request of the contractor. It's not coming as a direct request of Valerie or anybody in the administration where I have that level of trust to maybe do something like this on first reading. That's all I'm saying, is I would like to be able to do my job, research this a little more, and then make a move at the next meeting.
I'll look forward to the due diligence. I'll be interested to hear.
My concern is this. I mean, Mr. Spade is making a genuine, is expressing a genuine concern. To assume this is because of an election year, any of us who know Mr. Spade know that knows that he takes his due diligence seriously. I don't know if anybody on this council is more involved in community activities, going to meetings outside of here. I'm sure Tressa would enjoy it if he wouldn't go to so many, meetings. But to suggest this is some sort of electioneering year, I don't know what Mr. Spate gets out of this politically to say, I want to take some more time with this to make sure we're spending $300,000 wisely. I mean, again, I think my concern about it is the 3-year, 5-year thing, where we're holding a 5-year lease over a company that may not be here in 3 years. What happens to the property after that? And so that's my concern about it. And I just want to make sure that we are covering our bases here, so we're not stuck with paying for a lease or paying for equipment we're not going to use because we decided to do something else with the golf course. That's my concern. So I think that the administration addressed that during committee, but Mr. Braswell bringing that up, just kind of reignited that concern for me. And to suggest that we're somehow playing politics with this thing is just, I think it's really, I couldn't think of anything further from the truth.
Well, we do have a motion and a second on the table that needs attention. Does everyone agree?
What's the motion for?
The motion was to bypass committee deliberations. Chris made the motion. Who seconded that?
I did.
You did. I was hoping that
Let me
was
ask-
Justin.
Let me ask you this, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me ask you this.
Mr. Mayor.
If let's say you could get passed on first reading, and you go to a vote, if we didn't get 5 votes, you couldn't enact for 30 days anyhow.
Right.
So if they're not going to agree with our consultant that that's a wise purchase, and they want to take 2 weeks to go look at the equipment and make that decision, and we can get a unanimous decision, we're actually better off if we hold off in terms of getting it done. Whether or not that's the prudent thing, I'm not going to say, but that's the better option of the two, so.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that suggestion because you're exactly right, because 14 days is less than 30, and they're going to need that equipment probably yesterday.
Yes, I'll withdraw my motion.
Okay, motion withdrawn. So our next order of business is to continue reading the correspondence.
Got it.
Legislation.
Legislation. Yep. Okay. 2019 R17, a resolution awarding a contract to Abbott Electric, Inc. for the Toric Center walking path lighting and declaring an emergency.
This be referred to the Intergovernmental and Parks Committee.
It's environmental, sorry,
What'd I say?
intergovernmental.
I'm sorry, I was,
Half mine, half
share
yours.
I had Odell Beckham on my mind.
So do I.
2019 R18, a resolution authorizing the mayor to engage Prime AE Group, Inc. for professional planning and engineering services related to the Arlington Road Corridor Study and declaring an emergency.
This be referred to the Transportation, Connectivity, and Stormwater Committee.
2019 R19, an emergency resolution authorizing the mayor to accept a transfer of bridge ownership and maintenance responsibilities for bridges located in the city of Greene from Summit County to the city of Greene and declaring an emergency.
This will be referred to the Transportation, Connectivity, and Stormwater Committee.
2019 R20, a resolution awarding a contract to Melway Paving Company, Inc. for the 2019 Parks Pavement Maintenance, making an appropriation and declaring an emergency.
This will be referred to the Finance Committee.
2019 R21, a resolution awarding a contract to Carvo Companies, Inc. for the State Route 619 and Myersville Road roundabout, reclassify in advance as a transfer, making an advance, making an appropriation, and declaring an emergency.
This will also be referred to the Finance Committee.
2019 R22, an emergency resolution declaring the necessity and intention to appropriate for street purposes certain fee simple interests temporary and permanent easements in and to various premises along State Route 619, Myersville Road, altogether with the necessary appurtenances thereto, further identified as the State Route 619 Myersville Road roundabout project, and declaring an emergency.
This will be referred to the Finance Committee.
That's it.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. The next thing on our agenda is the report of council committees. The first committee to report this evening is the Finance Committee, chaired by Mr. Humphrey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance did meet this evening. Myself, Mr. Yergin, Mrs. Babbitt were present. We had a third reading of 2019 R10, a resolution authorizing the transfer of funds from the unappropriated balance of the Pipeline Settlement Fund to the Fire Station Number 3 construction account, making an appropriation and declaring an emergency. We had a couple-hour discussion on this. Mrs. Babbitt has offered an amendment, which we had ample opportunity to discuss at committee this evening. And so at this time, I would make a motion to amend, and the amendment is in front of everyone. I would make a motion to amend 2019 R10.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to amend 2019 R10. Any discussion, excuse me? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
And at this time, I move to adopt 2019 R10 as amended.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adopt 2019 R10 as amended. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Sure. Mr. Humphrey?
Yes.
Mr. Yergin?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Mr. Spate?
Yes.
Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Babbitt?
Yes.
Adopted 7-0.
And I just want to thank Mrs. Babbitt for her leadership on that and coming up with that amendment and working through the channels on that. Thank you, Mrs. Babbitt. The next piece of legislation we discussed this evening on second reading, 2019 R14, a resolution to enter into a memorandum of agreement for deposit of public funds, active, interim, and/or inactive deposits with Huntington National Bank and declaring an emergency. These agreements come up every 3 years. Of course, Huntington Bank has gone through an acquisition, and so this agreement has come up. This is pretty pro forma. According to state law, we have to have these depository agreements on so that they can accept the money and so that we can have them be a depository for the money, in this case, up to $25 million. The committee agreed that we should move on second reading passage, and so at this time, I would move to bypass the 3-reading rule on 2019 R14.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to bypass the 3-reading rule on 2019 R14. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
This time, I move to adopt 2019 R14.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adopt 2019 R14. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Humphrey?
Yes.
Mr. Yergin?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Mr. Spate?
Yes.
Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Babbitt?
Yes.
Adopted 7-0.
The next item the committee discussed was the first reading of the piece of legislation, but because that was not going to pass on the motions to bypass committee deliberations in the 3-reading rule, and that's 2019 R16, the committee requests time on that piece of legislation.
Time will be granted.
We had no items of old or new business, and we adjourned at 6:45.
Thank you, Mr. Humphrey. The next committee to meet this evening was Environment and Parks, chaired by Mr. Spate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Myself, Mrs. Babbitt, and Mr. Shaughnessy were here. We did have one item of legislative business, and this was on third reading, 2019-02, an ordinance authorizing the selection of EnviroScience Incorporated as the firm to provide design-build services to the city for the design and construction of the city's Bettler Park stream restoration and stabilization, and declaring an emergency. This was third reading on this piece of legislation. We had talked about it in pretty good detail at last meeting, where we identified the streams that were to be restored, and the funding, which is $300,000, $150 of that will be returned from Ohio Public Works Commission through a grant. At this time, I move that we adopt 2019-02.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adopt 2019-02. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Sure. Mr. Spate?
Yes.
Mrs. Babbitt?
Yes.
Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
Mr. Humphrey?
Yes.
Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Mr. Yergin?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Adopted 7-0.
We had no other items of business for the Environment and Parks Committee, and we adjourned sometime late.
Thank you, Mr. Spate. The next committee to report is the Public Safety, chaired this evening by Mrs. Babbitt.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Public Safety Committee met this evening. Mr. Humphrey, Mr. Dyer, and I were all present. We had one item of business before us, a license item, TMP 2472, a liquor license transfer from Zena Genovese and Patio 3719 South Main Street to Ramp Restaurant LLC, DBA Ramp and Patio Permit D5. We were given no information, or the Summit County Sheriff's Department looked into this. They gave us no reason that the liquor license should not be transferred. There have been no problems there. So at this point, I will move that we do not hold a hearing regarding TMP 2472.
Second?
I have a motion and a second not to have a hearing on item TMP 2472. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Mr. President,
Should we
we
do a
typically
voice
do
vote?
voice vote on that.
Okay, well, I'll take that back. Sounds like they're in favor, though. Will you, clerk, please call the roll?
Sure. Mrs. Babbitt?
Yes.
Mr. Humphrey?
Yes.
Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Mr. Spate?
Yes.
Mr. Yergin?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Good, 7-0.
7-0.
There was no other business before our committee, and we were adjourned.
Thank you, Mrs. Babbitt. The next committee to report this evening is Planning, Community, and Economic Development, chaired by Mr. Yergin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Myself, Mr. Spate, and Mr. Young were present. We did have 3 items before us tonight. One on third reading was 2019-01, an ordinance declaring a portion of improvements to a certain parcel of real property owned by Arlington Ridge Townhomes, LP, to be a public purpose, exempting 100% of the value of the improvements from real property taxation for 30 years, and declaring an emergency. This was discussed both at our last meeting. There wasn't much to add tonight. It is on third reading passage, and in light of that, I would move to adopt 2019.
Are we requesting time on this?
Yeah.
Requesting time.
Oh, I'm sorry. My mistake. There was a request for additional time.
Time will be granted.
I checked that, thank you. On second reading, there was 2019 R11, a resolution accepting the Planning and Zoning Commission's approval of the replat of Lot 1R of Heritage Crossings of Green Phase 1 and declaring an emergency. This was discussed in committee, and it is pretty much a pro forma action. It is to allow the Chipotle to come, and because we're all eager to see that happen, there was discussion of passing it on second reading. The committee was in favor, and so at this time, I would move to bypass the 3 reading rule on 2019 R11.
Second.
No,
I ha-
it's, yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
I have a motion and a second to bypass the 3 reading rule on 2019 R11. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
At this time, I move to adopt 2019 R11.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to adopt 2019 R11. Is there any discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Yergin?
Yes.
Mr. Spate?
Yes.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Mr. Shaughnessy?
Yes.
Mr. Humphrey?
Yes.
Mr. Dyer?
Yes.
Mrs. Babbitt?
Yes.
Adopted 7-0.
The last item that we considered was 2019-04, an ordinance establishing public notification requirements prior to city council action, authorizing city funds or authorizing the application for grants or other funding methods to be used for the design or construction of the master trail plan or similar long-range city developed planning or portions thereof, and declaring an emergency. This was legislation sponsored by Mr. Shaughnessy and co-sponsored by Mr. Dyer. Mr. Shaughnessy presented his thoughts about the legislation. There was discussion about it, input both from our law director and Mr. Weavy. And it was determined that essentially there's a good idea here that needs work, and so we're going to ask for time. And because the trail plan has now been, for lack of a better term, pulled back by the mayor to be worked on in conjunction with the long-term parks plan, I believe, we do have time to work on this and get it right. And so, Mr. President, we will be asking for plenty of time.
Plenty of time will be granted. Anything else to report, Mr. Yergin?
That was it. We had no new or old business, and our committee adjourned late into the night.
Thank you, Mr. Yergin. The next committee to meet is Rules and Personnel, chaired by myself. All members are present. We had one item of legislation on second reading, 2019-03, an ordinance amending rules of the Civil Service Commission of the City of Greene and declaring an emergency. We did have a brief discussion on this piece of legislation. As you know, there's a Civil Service Commission who is tasked with looking over the civil service, I guess, rules and guidelines. It's been 2013 since they've updated those. So at this time, the committee will request time. Time will be granted. There was no other business, and we were adjourned at 7:55. The next committee to meet is Transportation, Connectivity, and Stormwater, chaired this evening by Mr. Shaughnessy.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Myself, Mr. Young, Mr. Yergin were present. We had one item of legislation. It's 2019 R12 as amended. A resolution awarding a contract to North Star Asphalt Incorporated for the 2019 resurfacing project and declaring an emergency. This is a contract for various road resurfacing projects. In 2019, it totals $1,755,339.85. This is on second reading, so the committee requests time.
Time will be granted.
Thank you. Having no other items of legislation, we adjourned at 8:16.
Thank you, Mr. Shaughnessy. The next committee to meet this evening was Intergovernmental and Utilities, chaired by Mr. Dyer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Myself, Mr. Shaughnessy, and Mr. Spate were here. However, we had no items of legislative business, so we didn't meet.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. The next committee to report is the Charter Amendment Implementation Committee, chaired this evening by Mr. Yergin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Myself, Ms. Babbitt, and Mr. Shaughnessy were present, but we also had no items of legislation and therefore did not meet.
Thank you, Mr. Yergin. The next item on our agenda here is the mayor's report.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I got quite a few things, actually. So one of the more important programs that I think we have as a city is our Student Municipal Representative Program. It's not easy to say, but it's a great program. This is a program for students in grades 10 through 12 to join one of our boards or commissions or council as a non-voting member. The application deadline for this year's selection will be Monday, April 1st. And for more information, see the city's website or contact Sarah Herring at 330-896-6614. Also, the City of Greene is accepting applications from local not-for-profits for the 2019 Living Green Community Grant. The application deadline for that is Friday, April 26th at 3 p.m. And once again, for more information, see the city's website or contact Sarah Herring. A few items in the recent past. On Saturday, March 2nd, about a week and a half ago, I joined Acme Fresh Market in celebrating Ohio's 216th birthday with balloons and cake. Later that week, on Tuesday, March 5th, we had a drug task force educational series entitled Beyond Drugs, Managing Chronic Pain. Simple Ways to Reduce Surgery Downtime. That was the second, and the future one, the third one, will be in April, and that'll be entitled Beyond Drugs, Managing Chronic Pain by Tara Scott from Summa Hospital, and that will be on Tuesday, April 16th. On Wednesday, March 6th, there was a Drug Task Force Faith-Based Committee breakfast, and our main topic of that was Crisis Awareness Sunday, which is coming up this year on May 5th. See your local church for service times, and you'll hear a sermon about addiction and mental health issues. And then on Thursday, March 7th, I attended American Red Cross Heroes Dinner, honoring local heroes. Of note, Virginia Adicott, President and CEO of FedEx Custom Critical and Green, received the 2019 H. Peter Berg Community Leadership Award. So congratulations to Virginia. And then on Friday, March 8th, the Green Drug Task Force and GO Team presented to the Green Chamber of Commerce, a discussion led by Andy Platt from the Drug Task Force and Chief Fanai. Earlier, Mr. Braswell mentioned the volunteer project last Saturday at Aris Park Dog Park. The park is scheduled to open on May 3rd at 1 p.m. with a ribbon cutting and ceremonial tree planting in celebration of the opening of the dog park and Arbor Day. Open house is May 4th from 9 a.m. to noon at the dog park. And also last Saturday, Mensch's Brothers celebrated their 25th anniversary, and they celebrated with $5 hamburgers. So I hope you had a chance to get one. They're very good. And then Sunday, I attended an Eagle Scout recognition banquet. It was at Neomed, and all those scouts are very impressive. But I was surprised that sitting next to me was Valerie Carr's son, Seth, who was being honored for receiving his Eagle Scout Award. So congratulations to Seth and the Carr family. And then yesterday, the Technology Committee visited the Medina County High-Speed Fiber Network Operations Center to see their high-speed system in progress, something that we're studying very carefully to bring here to the City of Greene. And then a couple upcoming meetings. On Tuesday, March 19th, will be a community information meeting and Narcan training. That will be at 7 p.m. right here at the Central Administration Building. If you would like to have Narcan in your possession, in case you were to need it at any time, you have to be trained, and so you can come here. Once you're trained, you will receive a Narcan kit if you ever have the need for it. And then on Wednesday, March 20th, the Engineering Department will be recognized at the 16th Annual American Society of Highway Engineers for an outstanding highway project, and they're receiving the award for the 619 Pickle Road Roundabout. So congratulations to the Engineering Department. You'll hear more about that in the upcoming future. And lastly, we have a confirmed date for one of our Drug Task Force events. This is an event we've done in our city a couple times before. It is called Hidden in Plain Sight. We encourage all parents and others to come, everybody except children, because they're not welcome to see the presentation. It will not be videotaped for the same reason. That will be on Thursday, April 25th. Hidden in Plain Sight, that'll be at 6 p.m. at the Central Park Community Hall. And for those who say the way to get people to come is to provide food, there will be a light dinner served. And so if that's your incentive, we're glad to provide that incentive for you to come learn about where children may be hiding or using drugs. So that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is there any other business?
Let's go.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned.